Okay, picture this. Right now, there is a massive constitutional standoff happening in Virginia over a frozen redistricting referendum. And it's not just a local issue. This single dispute could, quite literally, decide the balance of power in the U.S. House of Representatives. And the craziest part? It's all hanging on a razor-thin 2.9% voting margin. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking an incredibly high-stakes political thriller that is playing out in real time. It's really got the whole shebang, contested district lines, totally unprecedented amounts of dark money, and a monumental legal battle that could completely redefine how mid-decade elections are run nationwide. Here's a quick roadmap for This Explainer. We'll start with the standoff itself. Then we'll visually compare the controversial maps, follow the money trail, unravel the procedural courtroom drama, and then examine the three core legal questions currently before the state's highest court. Finally, we'll look at the massive national impact. Okay, let's dive into this.
Section 1. The Redistricting Standoff. High Stakes in the Commonwealth.
To really understand why Virginia is in such chaos today, we kind of have to rewind to 2020. That's when voters narrowly approved taking the power to draw voting districts away from the state legislature, right? And they gave it to a bipartisan commission. But, well, that commission deadlocked almost immediately. The courts had to step in. Fast forward to recently, and a new amendment passed to yank that map-drawing power right back to the General Assembly. You might be wondering, why go through all that trouble? It literally all comes down to this one number, 10-1. That's the projected split of Virginia's congressional delegation, 10 Democrats to 1 Republican, if the proposed map drawn by the legislature actually goes into effect. It's a staggering shift in power, which is exactly why the stakes for this mid-decade redistricting effort are absolutely monumental.
Section 2. Comparing the district maps. Lines of power.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core of the debate. On the left, you've got the map drawn by the bipartisan court process. That one yielded a highly competitive 6-5 Democratic split, which, largely mirrored Virginia's status as a purple state. But on the right is the newly proposed 2026 map. It's branded by its proponents as the fairness map, and it engineers that massive 10-1 Democratic advantage. Now, Democratic leaders argue this map is a totally necessary defensive measure. They frame it as a way to counteract aggressive Republican gerrymandering in other states, like Texas and North Carolina.
But to actually achieve that 10-1 split, the map designers had to get pretty creative, and that has led to some fierce controversy. The prime example is the proposed 7th district. People are widely calling it the Lobster District. And yeah, looking at its shape, you probably wouldn't want to find this at a local seafood bake. Notice how the geographical claws reach deep into rural, Republican-leaning Piedmont farmland, while the tail is anchored all the way up in the dense, high-population metro stops of Arlington. The big debate here centers on what's called a community of interest, because over 58% of the voting power is concentrated in that urban tail. Critics argue this effectively allows the urban vote to completely overwhelm the rural vote. I mean, it forces a single representative to somehow balance the drastically different daily needs of metro commuters with those of rural farmers living on dirt roads.
Section 3. The Dark Money Flood, a National Proxy War.
So, to get this constitutional amendment passed, an absolutely unprecedented flood of cash poured into the state. It effectively turned what should be a highly technical local referendum into a vicious national proxy war. Just looking at this breakdown, the sheer volume of outside funding is staggering. We're talking roughly $93 million in total. The pro-amendment side spent about $64 million, heavily backed by groups like House Majority Forward and the Fairness Project. On the flip side, the anti-amendment side spent over $30 million total, fueled by undisclosed Republican donors and the Justice for Democracy PAC, which is linked to Peter Thiel. But the most vital takeaway here is transparency, or rather, the total lack of it. 95% of these funds came from 501c4 groups. If you're not familiar, these are dark money organizations that are legally permitted to keep their donors entirely secret.
And as you might expect, with that dark money came some highly provocative direct mail tactics. The Justice for Democracy PAC, who opposed the amendment, targeted black voters with mailers utilizing really traumatic Jim Crow-era imagery. We're talking pictures of police dogs and the KKK, claiming politicians were trying to silence their voices. Unsurprisingly, these tactics drew immediate bipartisan backlash. Virginia's Attorney General Jay Jones and the Virginia NAACP actually issued a joint condemnation. They called them, and I quote, reprehensible racist tactics designed to suppress participation. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how this intense campaign messaging created an incredibly lumpy electorate on the ground. The message that rural voters were losing their voice to districts like that lobster we talked about, it resonated deeply. Look at rural Southwest Virginia. Early voting surged by an astonishing 41%. Meanwhile, in the urban Democratic strongholds of the Richmond Metro and Northern Virginia areas, turnout plummeted by 19% and 25%.
So the rural surge was massive, right? But because those counties are just generally less populous, it simply wasn't quite enough to overcome the dense urban vote. The referendum passed, but again, by that razor-thin 2.9% margin.
Section 4. Procedural challenges. The path to limbo.
Let's step away from the campaign trail and into the courtroom to see why this newly approved 10-to-1 map isn't actually being used right now. Because despite voters narrowly passing the referendum, the whole thing is completely frozen. To understand this legal limbo, we have to trace the fast-tracked legislative process step by step. Amending the Virginia Constitution requires a very specific sequence. First, the amendment must pass the General Assembly. Then, there must be an intervening general election, and then it must pass the newly seated Assembly again before finally going to the voters. Well, proponents squeezed this in by passing it first in October 2025, utilizing a lingering 2024 special session that hadn't technically closed. Then came the November 2025 election, the second passage in January 2026, and the voter approval in April. But almost immediately, a Tazewell County judge blocked the certification of the results, citing massive procedural violations. That judge, Judge Jack Hurley, issued a sweeping final judgment, declaring the entire legislative process void ab initio. To put that into plain English, this means it was invalid from the very outset. He ruled that the General Assembly violated strict statutory mandates, things like failing to properly post the proposed amendments at local courthouses. He also ruled that the ballot question itself, which asked voters if they wanted to restore fairness, was flagrantly misleading and partisan. Essentially, he declared the entire process legally broken before a single citizen even cast a vote.
Section 5. 3 core legal questions. The SCOVA climax.
Naturally, the injunction was appealed, and the Supreme Court of Virginia, often referred to as SCOVA, has declined to lift the block, setting the stage for a monumental, impending final ruling. So the crucial point is that their final decision will likely hinge on 3 highly precise technical questions of law. First up is the scope of special sessions. Can a special session originally convened months prior for a budget dispute be legally used to fast-track completely unrelated constitutional changes? Second, the temporal definition of an election. The state constitution requires an intervening election. Opponents argue that because early voting had already been underway for over a month when the first bill passed, the election had technically already started. But the state argues only election day itself matters, which definition is right. And third, the mandate. Is a statutory rule requiring proposed amendments to be physically posted at courthouses 90 days before an election a strict legal requirement, or is it just sort of an outdated guideline? How the court answers these 3 specific questions will completely decide the fate of the state's maps.
Section 6. The national impact. A test case for democracy.
As we wait for this ruling, it is absolutely critical to zoom out. The fallout here extends far, far beyond the borders of Virginia. The state has basically become the ultimate test case for mid-decade redistricting. Let's look at it impartially. The Democratic argument is built on rejecting unilateral disarmament. They're stating that if they play nice with bipartisan commissions, while other states gerrymander, they are essentially committing political suicide. On the other hand, the Republican argument is focused strictly on defending the rule of law, constitutional procedure, and protecting the voting power of rural citizens. The immediate midterm impact of all this? Massive. Depending on how courts rule in Virginia and other states, 9 to 10 U.S. House seats are currently at play nationally. That's enough to flip control of Congress. Right now, actual congressional candidates are in total limbo. Representatives like Jen Kiggans and Ben Cline are actively campaigning just weeks before primary elections without actually knowing what their district lines will look like or even who their voters will be.
Which leaves us with this really profound question to ponder as we eagerly await the Supreme Court of Virginia's final ruling. If this amendment survives, will mid-decade redistricting simply become the new normal across the country? And, in a deeply polarized nation, how much representation should a political majority allow a minority to have? Thank you for joining this explainer. Keep a close eye on the Commonwealth, folks. The ripple effects of this single legal battle will undoubtedly shape the future of American democracy.